The desert morning at Forward Operating Base Serpent began with a glare that flattened the horizon and pressed heat into every surface. Dust swirled against the concrete barriers, carried by a dry wind that smelled faintly of fuel and cordite. The compound was alive with its usual rhythm operators striding toward the motor pool, voices carrying orders. The occasional bark of laughter that felt too sharp in the brittle air. In the middle of this routine, Sergeant Araceli Navarro knelt on the packed earth beside a crate of supplies, her attention fixed on her medical kit. She moved with a steadiness that ignored the noise around her. Gauze, bandages, antibiotics, saline all checked and logged with the precision of habit. On the inside cover of her journal, her handwriting recorded every item, every count. The small book was more than an inventory. It carried the weight of lives saved, procedures performed under fire, and losses she still traced with her pen, as if the act of writing could soften the memory. Her fingers lingered over the leather binding before she turned another page. Each entry was careful and exact, a ritual that steadied her in a place where chaos was constant. The others noticed only in passing, nodding at the medic, who always had her kit ready. To them, it was simply her role. To her, it was discipline, the one constant she could control. Across the compound, operators clustered near the tactical tent, their voices cutting through the wind. Lieutenant Thorne's tone carried easily. 2 weeks until rotation, he called, brushing past her position without a glance. Expect activity before then. The words stirred unease, but no one looked at her for input. She closed the journal, stood, and followed the group into the tent, taking her usual place at the edge. Commander Weston Blackwood unfurled maps across the table, tracing valleys and ridgelines with a calloused finger. One by one, he assigned positions, sniper on overwatch, demolition at the western approach, comms in the post. When his eyes found her, he did not hesitate. Navarro, aid station, rear quadrant. She raised her head slightly. Sir, I've completed the advanced tactical course. I can take a forward position. A ripple of amusement circled the table. Medics patch holes, not make them, Riker said, his grin unkind. The chuckles that followed were quiet but sharp. Blackwood's voice cut the sound short, but his eyes held the same judgment. We need you for medical support. That's your function. She nodded once, her face calm, returning to her notes as though the sting had not reached her. Years of practice kept her expression still. Inside, the words echoed with the weight of repetition. She had heard them in every form since her first deployment. A medic was valuable, but not trusted beyond the boundaries of the oath written on the caduceus painted across her helmet. First, Dunwarm. Later, in her quarters, the desert noise dimmed. She slid a case from beneath her bunk, untangling earbuds that carried the sound of Bach through the hum of generators. As the music steadied her, she disassembled her sidearm on the cot, each piece laid out in order. Her hands moved with surgical precision, the same steady rhythm she had used to clamp arteries and stitch torn flesh in the dust of battle. The ritual was not only maintenance but memory. A hidden shooting trophy sat buried in her footlocker, its shine dulled with time. It was proof of another life, one she did not speak of. On summer mornings in Montana, her grandfather had placed a rifle in her hands and taught her how to breathe between heartbeats, how to let the trigger break like glass. She had held state records before she was 18. Her name whispered around Olympic trials she never attended. Instead, she enlisted. The trophies stayed hidden, her skill unspoken, her capacity unseen by those who dismissed her. Outside, the laughter of soldiers carried through the thin walls, the sound of belonging she had never quite shared. She fitted the final piece of her weapon back into place and removed the earbuds. The silence of the room pressed close. To them, she was the medic, the quiet one with the journal and the oath. But beneath the surface was a truth no one here cared to notice. She was both healer and marksman. Two halves of a skill set that waited in silence. Unrecognized. Until the day, circumstance would force the boundary to break. The tent canvas sagged under the weight of midday heat, sunlight burning through in harsh yellow shafts that lit the tactical table. Commander Weston Blackwood stood at its center. One hand pressed against the map spread across the wood. His presence filled the space, his voice cutting through the buzz of the generator outside. Every man leaned in as he moved markers across valleys and ridges, red pins tracing anticipated routes of insurgent movement. Sergeant Araceli Navarro waited near the edge, her medical journal tucked under her arm, her eyes following the terrain lines with the same precision she once used to line up a rifle sight. Blackwood outlined assignments with clipped authority: Riker, Western Patrol; Thorn, Motor Pool Watch; Zephyr, Overwatch at the Ridge. When he paused, she stepped forward half a pace. "Sir, the southern ridge has a blind angle. If you place an Overwatch team here, you'll catch movement before they hit the perimeter." The silence that followed lasted only a second before the chuckles spread. Riker smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Let the medic handle broken bones, not battle positions." Another voice muttered agreement. Blackwood did not laugh, but his jaw tightened. "Navarro, aid station, rear sector. That's your lane." He moved on without another glance, his focus already shifting to fuel convoys and supply runs. She held her posture, face impassive, though a flush burned across her neck. Years of repetition had trained her not to argue, not to let the sting break the surface. She lowered her eyes to her journal, pretending to write, while the sound of muted amusement filled the tent. When the briefing ended, the operators filed out in pairs, their voices still carrying fragments of jokes. She walked past them into the sunlight, squinting against the glare, her boots stirring dust from the hard ground. The lines on the map lingered in her mind even as she turned toward the medical tent. There, at least, she had control. The evening brought a different crisis. A village boy, no more than 8, was carried in by 2 elders whose faces showed exhaustion and worry. His skin burned with fever, his lips dry and cracked. Navarro took him from their arms without hesitation. Laying him gently on the cot, she touched his wrist, counted the rapid pulse, then reached for her kit. The boy's eyes flickered open, glassy and unfocused. She worked quickly, her movements precise. An IV line was assembled with practice speed. One try, a needle sliding into the vein without hesitation, fluid beginning to drip. She cooled his skin with damp cloths, measured antibiotics, calculated doses in her head while her pencil scratched quick notes into her journal at the bedside. The elders hovered, murmuring prayers in a language she only half understood. Outside the tent flap, soldiers lingered, drawn by the sound of urgency. Zephyr stepped closer, arms crossed, watching as she improvised with limited supplies. His gaze shifted from her calm expression to the child's chest, which soon began to rise more evenly. She adjusted the flow of the IV, checked vitals again, and nodded with quiet satisfaction. The boy would live, she told the elders softly, and though they may not have caught the exact words, they understood the tone. Relief spread across their tired faces. When the others drifted back toward the mess hall, Zephyr remained for a moment longer. His usual half-smile was gone. "You didn't even hesitate," he said, voice low. She finished logging the last of the details in her journal before answering, "You never hesitate with life in front of you." She closed the book, set it aside, and reached for fresh bandages as though the matter required no further reflection. Outside, the desert wind picked up, rattling loose canvas and carrying grit across the compound. Tension hummed beneath the routine, more patrols, sharper glances at the horizon, the unspoken acknowledgement that something was coming. Within that pressure, Navarro's calm presence stood out, even if most refused to see it. Her strength lay not in demands for recognition but in action, carried out with steady hands. Whether placing a pin on a map or sliding a needle into a vein, the storm was still days away. But already the cracks in the hierarchy had shown. She would remain in the rear sector on paper, unseen by command. Yet her composure, her ability to move without fear, had begun to draw quiet attention. Zephyr's eyes had carried more than curiosity. They carried the first hint of respect. The first blast landed before dawn. A dull thud that shook the ground and threw grit into the air. A moment later came the second, closer, followed by the rising whistle of mortar shells overhead. Forward operating base Serpent erupted into chaos. The horizon, once faint with a thin line of orange light, now flashed with bursts of fire. Dust and stone rained down from the compound walls as men scrambled for cover, voices colliding in panic. Sergeant Araceli Navarro was already moving. She grabbed her field kit from its place by the cot and sprinted toward the aid station, her boots striking the packed ground in a rhythm that cut through the confusion. Another explosion tore the corner off a guard post. Sending two soldiers tumbling, she slid to them, her knees hitting dirt. One man clutched his thigh, blood pumping bright against the pale dust. Without hesitation, she clamped the artery, pulled a tourniquet free, and locked it tight. The other lay stunned, ears ringing, fragments lodged in his arm. She wrapped gauze around the wounds, pressed his hand down firmly, and shouted for help to move him. Her voice was calm, firm, unshaken. Others around her shouted in panic, but she spoke in commands measured and precise. Carry him to the aid station. Elevate his head. Keep pressure here. Soldiers obeyed, drawn to the steadiness that cut through the rising smoke. The sky ripped again. A shell landed near the motor pool, throwing Zephyr to the ground. She saw him drop, his rifle spinning out of reach. The blast carried shrapnel that scythed through the sand. Without thinking, she dove across the gap, body shielding his dirt and heat swallowed them. She tasted iron in her mouth, ears ringing with the concussion. When the haze cleared, she pulled him by his vest toward the shattered wall, dragging him inch by inch until they reached cover. Zephyr groaned, his leg soaked with blood. His eyes were wild, disoriented, but her hands were steady as stone. She tore open his pant leg, found the wound, and pressed a clotting bandage into place. Her kit opened across the ground, instruments scattered but arranged by instinct into order. She tied another tourniquet, checked his pulse, and leaned close enough for him to hear, "You'll live, stay still." Her tone was not loud, but the conviction steadied him more than the bandage. She scanned the compound. Communications had gone silent. Antennas bent by fire. The aid station overflowed already, men spilling out into the open ground, their uniforms streaked with blood. The small tent strained under the weight of casualties. She hauled Zephyr onto a litter, flagged down two men, and sent him inside. Then she followed, stepping into heat and chaos that pressed like a physical weight. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and antiseptic. Cots jammed, shoulder to shoulder. Groans and cries rose in a steady tide. She moved through the crowd, shouting orders as she worked. IV bags were hung from rafters with strips of cloth, lines dripping steadily into pale arms. She decompressed a chest wound with practiced speed, releasing the hiss of trapped air as a soldier's eyes widened with relief. She packed another wound with gauze, stitched skin with hands that never shook. Her sidearm sat at her hip, untouched, while all around her the base shook with impact after impact. Dust filtered in through every flap, coating the floor, clinging to sweat-soaked uniforms. Cordite stung the air, burned into lungs, yet her voice cut through it all. Sharp and calm. Move that cot to the corner. Elevate him now. Check vitals again. You? Fetch more saline from the back. Operators who had once dismissed her now obeyed without hesitation. They saw not panic, not hesitation, but control. Every movement she made was deliberate, anchored by a discipline born from both battlefield medicine and years behind a rifle. She knew how to breathe through chaos, how to find stillness where others froze. The shells kept falling. The walls of the compound trembled, and still she moved from one broken body to the next. Sutures and splints in the same hands that had shielded Zephyr minutes before. The line between medic and warrior blurred in the firelit haze. At one point, a soldier's eyes rolled back. Pulsgång una her fingers. She pressed her fists into his chest, counted compressions, and demanded a breath bag. Another soldier knelt to help, his face pale, his hands clumsy. She guided him, her words steady. Faster. Push harder. Do not stop. When the man's chest rose again, when a cough rattled his lungs, she nodded once and moved on. The floor was slick with dirt and sweat, the smell of blood heavy as iron. Outside, the firefight raged without pattern, explosions punctuating the night. Inside, she carved order from ruin. Each patient stabilized another defiance of collapse. She did not flinch at the sound of gunfire drawing closer. She did not reach for her weapon. Her oath demanded she save life first. And she obeyed with every muscle, every breath. In the corner of the tent, Zephyr's eyes tracked her as she worked. He had seen the moment she dragged him through fire, the steadiness of her voice in his ear when the world came apart. Now he saw her lead without claiming authority, shaping Chaos into survival. For the first time, respect replaced doubt. The night was not over. The storm pressed harder against the walls. Communication still silent. Defenses failing. But Sergeant Araceli Navarro stood at the heart of it, her field kit open, her voice calm, her hands unshaking. The healer's oath held even as the war closed in from every side. The defense of Forward Operating Base Serpent fractured before sunrise. Mortar fire had torn sections of the wall open, and small arms fire poured through breaches as the operators fell back in scattered groups. The air was choked with dust and smoke, each explosion rattling the earth beneath them. Sergeant Araceli Navarro dragged a wounded soldier behind cover, her hands pressing into a bandage already dark with blood. When she looked up, she saw the front collapsing. The last defensive line formed around the command bunker, sandbags piled high. Men pressed shoulder to shoulder in desperation. A thunderous crack split the air as the 50 caliber machine gun on the perimeter fell silent. Its operator slumped across the weapon, head bowed, lifeless. The gun that had anchored their defense now stood unmanned, its long barrel smoking in the dry air. Enemy trucks moved closer through the haze, their silhouettes emerging like dark shapes against the rising sun. Shouts rose among the operators, panic edging into their voices. Commander Weston Blackwood, pinned down with blood streaking his shoulder, looked across the line. His gaze landed on Navarro. She was crouched with her field kit, one knee in the dirt, blood streaking her gloves. His jaw clenched. Navarro, to the gun. The words cut like a blade through the noise. For a moment, silence followed. Then protests erupted. She's a medic, Riker shouted. Disbelief, raw in his voice. She has no place on that weapon. Others echoed, fear and outrage mixing. But Blackwood's voice roared over them, sharp as steel. That is an order. Navarro did not hesitate. She slammed her kit shut, rose to her feet, and sprinted into open ground. Bullets carved the sand around her, spitting grit against her face. She ran with low strides, every movement calculated, and dove into the sandbag nest beside the dead gunner. The weight of the 50 caliber loomed before her, massive, immovable, built to dominate. She wrapped her hands around the grips, feeling the vibration of each round chambered, Her calluses fit against the metal as if they had always belonged there. Her grandfather's voice flickered in memory. Calm and steady. Breathe between heartbeats. Let the trigger break clean. She inhaled, pressed her cheek against the weapon, and squeezed. The gun thundered, its recoil slamming back into her shoulders. But her stance absorbed the force. Brass casings spat across the sandbags in a steady stream, glinting gold in the morning light. Each burst was not wild but deliberate. She tracked a truck through the haze, held her breath, and stitched fire across its engine block. The vehicle shuddered, burst into flames, and halted mid-charge. Operators who had been firing blindly now stopped to watch. Their disbelief cut through the chaos as she pivoted, adjusted, and targeted a mortar crew setting up beyond the ridge. One short burst and the tubes shattered, the crew scattering in panic. She shifted again, her movements surgical. Enemy fighters dove for cover, but could not escape the sweeping precision of her fire. Sandbags shook with each round, dirt spraying in waves. But her hands never faltered. Blackwood's eyes widened from behind cover, his expression a mix of shock and something heavier, respect dawning in real time. Thorne muttered, almost to himself. She's controlling the whole field. No one answered him. They were too busy staring at the medic they had dismissed. The one whose calm voice had once been ignored in the tent. Navarro's face remained composed. Yafset. Eyes narrowed in focus. The roar of the weapon, deafening to others, became rhythm in her chest. She fired in short, controlled bursts, each one precise, each one calculated. Vehicles burned. Advancing fighters dropped. For the first time since the assault began, the enemy faltered. A shell landed nearby, rattling the nest and showering her with debris. She ducked, then returned to the grips, her mind steady. She remembered long mornings in Montana fields, her grandfather watching silently as she learned to measure distance by instinct. Those lessons had never left her. Now they lived in every round she placed down range. The other operators, still firing, began to move in rhythm with her calls. Suppress left. Reload now. Shift fire to the ridge. Her words were crisp, commanding. Unshaken. The chain of command blurred as men obeyed her without thought. Because in that moment, she was not just a medic. She was the anchor that held their line. The final push of the attackers broke against her defense. Trucks smoldered. Weapons silenced. The morning light cut through drifting smoke, revealing the battlefield littered with wreckage. She lifted her hands from the grips, only when silence settled over the perimeter. The operators stared. Their faces carried disbelief, awe, and the quiet admission that everything they thought they knew about her had just shattered. Sergeant Araceli Navarro, once dismissed with a smirk, stood at the center of the broken nest, calm as though she had been born behind the weapon. The boundary had broken. She was no longer only the medic, she was something more, and everyone who had seen her fire that gun understood it. The barrel of the Prace, .50 caliber, glowed faintly from sustained fire, its thunder rolling across the desert like a storm that refused to pass. Sergeant Araceli Navarro's shoulders absorbed each recoil. Her hands locked steady on the grips as brass casings clattered at her feet. Dust hung thick in the air, shaken loose by every blast. But through it she could see the shapes of the attackers shifting, stalling under her fire. Reinforcements had not yet arrived. For 30 long minutes she held the sector almost alone. Her voice carried over the chaos. Sharp and calm. Suppress the ridge. Left flank moving. Hold fire until they cross the wire. The operators responded without hesitation. Even Thorne, who had once laughed at her suggestions in the briefing tent, now followed her lead. At one point he darted into the open, aiming for a new position, only to be caught by a burst from an enemy rifle. She saw it before he did, swung the weapon, and cut the threat down with 3 controlled bursts. Thorne froze, realization hitting as the rounds that would have ended him never landed. His eyes found hers. And for the first time, there was no doubt, only respect. The weight of command seemed to settle on her shoulders. Yet her face remained composed. Her breath came evenly. Her movements precise. Each burst placed with the rhythm of long practice. She fired not in desperation but in control. As though every shot was measured against an invisible scale only she could see. In her mind echoed her grandfather's steady voice, from years ago breathed between heartbeats. Trust your hands. Let the shot fall where it must. The battlefield gradually shifted. Enemy trucks smoldered. Mortar crews lay scattered. The relentless push slowed into uncertainty. Fighters hesitating at the edge of her field of fire. Around her, soldiers who once doubted her steadiness now watched with a mixture of awe and relief. The medic had become their anchor, and they clung to the line she drew with fire. Then her weapons stuttered, the belt running dry. For a heartbeat, the air felt hollow. She looked down at the last of the brass spilling out, her muscles tightening for what would come next. That was when Commander Weston Blackwood appeared. Crawling through the dirt, his face streaked, one arm bound tight with a bloodied bandage. He dragged a fresh box of ammunition to her side. His breath ragged. He shoved it into place and shouted above the roar of returning fire. "Where in hell did you learn to shoot like this?" His tone carried disbelief, but also something deeper curiosity edged with respect. She met his eyes briefly, hands already threading the new belt into the weapon. "My grandfather was a Marine sniper," she answered evenly. "He trained me from the time I could walk. I almost qualified for the Olympic team." The words were simple, unembellished, offered not as boast but as fact. Blackwood stared at her for a moment, stunned, before he gave a short nod. Then, "Keep doing what you're doing. It's working." He braced his good arm against the sandbags and added fire from his rifle, covering her flank. With the gun fed again, she unleashed another controlled barrage. The weapon's roar filling the air once more. The battlefield seemed to bend to her rhythm, the chaos narrowing into focus around her. Dust clouds lifted in waves as vehicles broke apart under fire. Soldier ducked low, advancing only to be driven back by her precision. The tide, once so close to crushing them, now pulled away. By the time reinforcements arrived, pouring into the compound with weapons raised, they found a defense already stabilized. Smoke drifted over burning wreckage. The critical sector still held, and at its center was Sergeant Araceli Navarro, helmet streaked with dust, hands steady on the grips of a weapon no one had believed she could master. For the men who had once dismissed her, the image burned into memory. She was no longer just the medic, confined to rear duty with a journal and a kit. She was both healer and warrior, and that truth could never again be denied. The smoke cleared slowly, hanging in thin veils across the battered compound. The cries of the wounded replaced the thunder of battle. Echoing against broken walls, Sergeant Araceli Navarro was back in the aid station. Sleeves rolled, her gloves slick with blood, not her own. The weapon that had held the line still cooled in its nest, but here she bent over torn flesh and shattered bone. Her needle flashing in rhythm with her breath, she worked as she always had, quiet and efficient. Yet every soldier who watched carried the memory of her at the gun. Cots filled the tent wall to wall. She moved between them, checking pulses, stitching deep cuts, resetting dislocated shoulders. Dust streaked her uniform. Dried blood smeared across her chest plate. But her dog tags glinted as she leaned close to listen for breath sounds. The same calm voice that had cut through battle now reassured the men she treated. "Hold still. You'll be fine. Drink slowly." Her tone was steady, the certainty undeniable. Blackwood stepped through the flap, his arm still bound from the wound he had carried into the fight. He watched her for a long moment before speaking. "That wasn't in your file," he said quietly, voice rough with fatigue. She didn't pause in her sutures. Files don't hold everything. His eyes narrowed. Your grandfather. She tied a final knot and glanced up. Marine sniper. State champion. He taught me to see what others missed. Her words carried no boast. Only truth spoken, because it no longer mattered to hide it. Blackwood gave a single nod. The kind that admitted understanding without ceremony, before stepping back to let her continue. Later, when the worst of the bleeding was controlled, Thorne approached her cot. His usual grin was gone, replaced by something heavier. He held out a pistol, the custom sidearm he had carried since his first deployment, its grip worn smooth. You saved my life, he said, voice low, so others could not hear. This is yours now. She looked at the weapon but did not reach for it. I don't need a gun to prove what I can do. He pressed it into her hands anyway. Maybe not, but I need you to have it. He turned before she could answer, leaving her standing with the weight of steel against her palm. Word spread quickly across Forward Operating Base Serpent. Stories of the medic who manned the .50 caliber traveled from bunk to bunker, each retelling colored by awe. Some spoke of the vehicles she burned, others of the way her commands cut through panic. By evening, even those who had laughed at her suggestions in the briefing tent looked at her differently. No one said the words out loud, but the silence that followed her steps was charged with recognition. She placed Thorne's pistol beside her surgical instruments on the cot, steel and steel in quiet symmetry. One meant to end life, the other to preserve it. Both belonged to her now. The boundaries the others had set, the medic who patched wounds, the operators who fought, had dissolved in the dust and fire of the battle. She had been both, seamlessly, and the truth could not be unseen. When the last patient was stabilized and the tent dimmed to lamplight, she finally sat, wiping her hands clean. Outside, the compound lay scarred but still standing. Inside, soldiers slept under the steady rhythm of her care. Recognition had come not from medals or ceremony but from the changed eyes of those who had witnessed her. Sergeant Araceli Navarro no longer walked in two worlds. She was both healer and warrior. And for the first time, everyone around her understood. The days after the assault carried a different rhythm across Forward Operating Base Serpent. Patrols still left at dawn. Reports still came in under the dry rasp of radio static, but something subtle had shifted. Where once Sergeant Araceli Navarro stood at the edges of tactical briefings, now eyes turned to her when terrain lines were marked and positions discussed. Commander Weston Blackwood gestured for her to step closer to the table, his tone clipped but inclusive. When she spoke, her words were weighed, considered, and then acted upon. The boundaries that once kept her in the aid station had dissolved in the smoke of the last battle. Riker, who had mocked her more openly than most, approached one evening with a rifle slung across his shoulder. His usual bravado was absent. Heard what you did with that 50 from, he muttered, scratching at the dust on his sleeve. Think you could teach me half that control? She studied him for a moment, then nodded once. At dusk, they met near the sand berm, where she corrected his stance with quiet patience, her hands adjusting his grip until the rifle aligned as it should. Safier, more hesitant, watched from a distance before stepping forward. He asked without words, and she included him without hesitation. Her legend began to take form not through ceremony but through these small moments. Soldiers passing by saw hardened operators standing in the dirt like students before a teacher. Word spread across the base with the same momentum as smoke drifting on the wind. The medic who had steadied hands for sutures also steadied rifles, her instructions shaping men who once would never have sought her guidance. Inside the medical tent, she trained the junior medics differently now. The mannequins lined the cots, chest cavities open for practice, EV lines hanging like vines. Yet beside the medical drills stood targets marked with silhouettes. She taught them that saving a life sometimes meant eliminating the threat that endangered it. She guided their hands not only in stitching flesh, but in holding a weapon with the same discipline. Her words carried a quiet authority, a certainty earned through fire. Even her gear reflected the change. Her Himmel, once marked only with the caduceus, now carried faint crosshairs etched around the symbol, a fusion of roles acknowledged without words. Her medical kit bulged not just with bandages and tourniquets, but with extra ammunition, a silent testament to the dual path she now walked. Soldiers noticed. They did not question it. Instead, they adjusted, treating it as natural, inevitable. Blackwood, watching from the edge of one session, caught her eye. He did not speak, but the faint nod he offered carried weight. In the next briefing, she found her seat no longer at the periphery, but directly across from him, central to the plan. Her insights shaped patrol patterns, overwatch assignments, casualty evacuation routes. No one protested. Respect had been carved into the memory of the compound with the roar of a machine gun and the calm of her hands afterward. Her presence became part of the rhythm of the base. Operators who once dismissed her now sought her judgment. Medics who once only imitated her precision now asked about weapon maintenance. The duality that had once been hidden was no longer questioned. It had been tested and proven, and the institution itself bent quietly to fit her truth. She never boasted, never raised her voice to claim authority. She simply did the work, teaching, healing, guiding, and the others adjusted around her. Transformation did not arrive as a sudden triumph, but as a quiet inevitability, as natural as dawn after night. The medic had become something more, and everyone at Forward Operating Base Serpent knew it. Months later, the desert felt like a distant memory. The clang of rifles at the range and the steady rhythm of boots on gravel now belonged to a stateside training program where Sergeant Araceli Navarro had been assigned as an instructor. Her classroom was simple rows of young medics, seated before mannequins stitched with mock wounds, beside targets painted with silhouettes. The pairing raised eyebrows at first, but none of her students questioned it for long. They watched her demonstrations in silence, saw the fluid way she shifted from suturing an artery to raising a weapon, and they understood. Her dog tags glinted each time she leaned over a cot, guiding careful hands through a stitch, then later correcting the grip on a rifle. The duality that once drew dismissal was now institutionalized, written into the training manual as procedure. They called it the Navarro Protocol in passing, though officially it carried a more technical name. Among the students, her story traveled in whispers how she had manned the boppers, 50 caliber in the dust of Serpent, how she had held the line with the calm of a surgeon. Each retelling shaped her into something more than a medic. Yet she never confirmed or denied the details. She simply taught, her presence proof enough. At night, when the classrooms were empty and the yard lay quiet, she opened her journal, the old pages of her grandfather's notes, ballistics calculations, Bastion diagrams. The philosophy of precision had been merged with her own meticulous entries. Medical charts now flowed into weapon data, lessons from combat set beside diagrams of veins and arteries. The book was thick, worn, and carried forward the voices of 2 generations. It was less a diary now than a manual, the blueprint of a doctrine built quietly in blood and endurance. The phone call from Blackwood came one evening, his voice rough with distance but steady with intent. He told her of a new kind of unit being assembled, one that would not divide roles so rigidly, one that required medics who could fight and fighters who could heal. He wanted her there, not as an exception, but as the foundation. She listened in silence. The weight of it measured not in pride, but in inevitability. She had known it was coming. Change always follows what has already been proven. In the training yard, she watched her students fire in slow rhythm, their movements awkward but improving. She saw herself in their effort, the same hunger to serve, the same restraint to endure. Her legacy did not need medals or speeches. It was already written into the way these young medics stitched and fired, into the way doctrine shifted without fanfare. Sergeant Araceli Navarro stood at the edge of the range, her journal tucked under her arm. the sun cutting low across the horizon, her story had become a quiet echo, not shouted, but carried forward in the hands of others. It was enough.